This is a short part two to my lecture about Black Little Theaters. This really is a sidebar, an extended sidebar on Angelina Grimke's play Rachel. I'm not having you read it this semester. I have sometimes, but I didn't do it this semester. But it's so important and such an interesting example of how theater history can help us understand history in general that I want to take a few minutes to tell you about the play and the playwright and the purpose for which it was written. Rachel is a anti-lynching play. Black theater artists widely participated in the anti-lynching movement in the United States. Sometimes they participated by writing plays, making paintings, writing poetry or music. Some Black artists, along with other activists, participated in sort of performative protests, which is what you see here in this picture. This is a photo of Black Americans protesting against lynching. They are standing in a public space with lynching ropes around their neck and signs indicating real people whose lives were taken to call attention to the issue of lynching. Anti-lynching plays can be considered, in part at least, influential to the development of these kinds of dramatic protests, and they were very effective. So what is lynching? I'm sure you've heard the term, and maybe you've studied it in a history class before. Lynching can be defined as murder by extrajudicial action, meaning people are killed for alleged crimes, but not within the judicial system. This isn't capital punishment. This is a mob violence, a vigilante mob violence for perceived crimes or violations of social code. Typically, it is murder of Black people for perceived crimes or, again, violations of social code. In the years 1882 to 1968, there's an estimated 4,743 lynchings in the United States. That's not accounting for unreported lynchings, but for deaths that were documented that appear to be lynchings. About 75% of those lynched in those cases were Black Americans. At the turn of the 20th century, there were an average of 100 lynchings a year being reported, without any real knowledge of how many weren't being reported. The first anti-lynching bill was proposed in Congress by the U.S. Representative George White. He was an African-American elected official. That did not pass. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was formed largely in response to lynching and to create a legal defense fund to protect people, to get them represented before something like this could happen, and to lobby for anti-lynching laws. Interestingly and terribly, the city where Baylor calls home is part of the story of lynching and of lynching ultimately being outlawed. In May of 1916, a young Black man named Jesse Washington was lynched publicly in Waco in front of the courthouse. It was a particularly brutal and horrifying murder. All lynchings are brutal and horrifying, but this one was particularly public. There were cheering crowds, and his body was desecrated after his death. It was photographed, this event, and reported on. And as upsetting as that is, the outcome of that public attention on the murder of Jesse Washington was that people could not deny the existing ongoing reality of Americans lynching other Americans. And it escalated the push for anti-lynching law. So people could not turn a blind eye to how barbaric this was and how unjust and how anti-American it was to be doing this. And so it really actually excelled the pace at which anti-lynching laws were finally enacted. So one thing that if you want to know more about this, you can look online about the death of Jesse Washington. It was called the Waco Horror. And you can find some very good scholarship and journalism out there about this barbaric lynching and its place in American history. But a lot of writers turned their creative energy towards doing work that would hasten the end of this action of lynching. And one of those was Angelina Grimke. Her father was the vice president of the NAACP and a Harvard-educated lawyer. So she grew up very well informed about current events and the law and about activities that were going on in the Black community, both positive and negative. She lived in Boston. She lived in Washington, D.C., and she became a writer fairly young. She wrote a lot of poetry. She wrote plays. She mostly wrote poetry, but her home was a place of education and a place of heightened awareness about the world, and we see that come out in what she wrote. In particular, the play that I wanted to tell you about is Rachel. She wrote it in 1916. She wrote it because of the popularity of Birth of a Nation. If you don't know much about Birth of a Nation, go look that up. So it's a very popular early example of popular film, maybe the first sort of what we would call, popular film, feature-length film in America in 1915, very, very early. And it is quite racist in its content, and it has depictions of lynching, which are treated as interesting and as not problematic. So she wanted to use her artistic creativity to show the actual reality of lynching. In particular, she was interested in depicting the essential humanity of Black Americans and the devastating psychological effect of systemic racism in America on the spiritual and mental health of Black Americans. So that's what Rachel is trying to do. In the play Rachel, we have this young woman depicted here in this photograph from the play who loves children, has a real zeal for life, but after learning about the lynching murder of people close to her, she starts to become increasingly fearful about the potential for there to be a future in which Black children are safe. And by the end of the play, she has decided that she'll never marry and never have children because she cannot bring children into a world that will crush them. She doesn't want to make beautiful, healthy young Black bodies that will only end up being victimized at the hands of white aggression. And so she sort of shuts it down. And it's this very dark image of the crisis of violence against Black America that is felt on a personal level in the play. And Rachel was effective. It created empathy, which is what Grimke hoped would happen. It was first performed at an NAACP rally, and people responded to it very emotionally. In particular, Grimke said that she wanted the play to be so powerful that white women would empathize with Black women who had seen their husbands and children lynched, that it would bridge the experience of white women and Black women through fiction in a way that could actually change the real world outside of the theater. Isn't that an amazing and powerful thing? And something that we know theater and other storytelling is able to achieve. We see that in anti-lynching plays. So think about this political, artistic, social connection here, and how it not only is exemplified in Grimke's Rachel, but also in other plays that are happening in the early 20th century, and how this is really part of what will become the nature of American theater, to use the platform of storytelling to try to make changes in the real world. That's connected to realism, isn't it? It's connected to things that we heard the realists said they wanted to do. That realization is coming to some sort of fruition here in the work of people like Angelina Grimke. All right, I'll talk to you later.